This video is part 1 of Chapter 9, Social Psychology, for PSY 110S, the Psychological Sciences. In this chapter, we have to cover a lot of territory. It's one of the longer chapters in your textbook. Social psychology is a broad field, so there are a lot of areas to cover. So we're going to start with looking at conformity, compliance, and obedience, as well as the impact of groups. And then we'll talk about attitudes and attributions, which is the portion of the chapter that is really mostly about social cognition. So let's start by talking about defining what social psychology is. Human beings are very social. We don't do well when we're completely isolated from other people. We're kind of built as a species to interact, to communicate, to read each other's behaviors and make predictions about what people are likely to do or not do. So that's why I say that human beings are social creatures. We influence each other's thinking, we influence each other's emotions and behaviors as well. Your textbook authors define social psychology as the scientific study of how we influence one another's thoughts and behaviors. As usual, I will add emotion to that and motivation as well. The focus is on primarily on how situational or environmental factors shape our behavior and thinking. And what that means is, the last chapter we were talking about personality. That's largely assumed to be an internal thing. That's something you have, it's yours personally. So if you're acting in accordance with your personality, that means that the environment is not causing it to occur. In social psychology, we're much more attuned to thinking about how the structure of an environment or the nature of a social interaction has a very strong impact on how people choose to behave or not choose to behave, as the case may be. So there are lots of historical examples that kind of shaped early social psychology. And I should pause here to say that social psychology is really a hybrid field. It's a mixture of sociology and psychology. And the way I look at it is that social psychology is the study of human behavior in a social context. So a lot of these early social psychologists in the U.S. were really struggling with how to explain human events like the Holocaust in the 40s, like the murder of Kitty Genovese in 1964. Many examples from military history, like the My Lai massacre, where soldiers, under orders from one of their officers, murdered non-combatants during Vietnam. And then your authors also used the People's Temple example as well. There were a lot of situations like this that early social psychologists really wanted to come up with good explanations for, because what united them in the early days of this field was that they didn't believe the popular explanation, which was bad people do bad things. It's a part of their nature. They're just evil or somehow wrong. These early social psychologists believed that while they're not dismissing the possibility that individuals could be evil, but instead they're saying there are a lot of people who get caught in situations that are so powerful that it can prompt them to do things that are very, very awful. The first concept that you need to get your head around to understand what social psychology is about is social influence. Social influence refers to how the presence of, or even just the imagined presence of people around us can influence how we act, how we think, how we feel. There are lots of different types. The ones that we're going to cover in this chapter are conformity, compliance, obedience, and broadly defined group influence. So we're going to start with conformity. Conformity, as defined in your chapter, is some change in behavior or cognition or emotion to conform to a group norm. The second stipulation is you're doing that conforming to that group norm because you perceive some form of group pressure, some kind of impulse coming from the group to push you in that direction. Now, in Western cultures, so Western Europe, North America, we tend to see the word conformity as an insult. So people who conform heavily are not independent, they're not capable, they're just caving to other people's wishes. So we tend to belittle it. At the same time, though, what research has shown pretty clearly is that human beings, their default position is conformity, and extreme independence is sort of like an override. We are designed as a social species, and we have a strong tendency to want to keep our social interactions fluid, and that often means just go along and don't make things more difficult. In our evolutionary history, this probably served us very well because, survival is hard enough. If you have to do it by yourself, it's much harder. So we need to find ways of staying in these relationships that we have. One key way of greasing the wheels of your social relationships is to get along, and one way to show that you're getting along is to do what other people do. And that shows your commitment to and your membership in the group. Now, there are a couple of broad types of social influence that are going to be really important for you to understand as we make our way through this chapter. The first is called informational social influence, and we're going to look at the classic study by Sharif on informational social influence. And then the second type is normative social influence. And we're going to look at the classic study by Solomon Asch to learn about that type of social influence. So first, the Sharif study. In this study, and here's where students sort of get into trouble with this study, and I included this graphic here off to the right, where which is basically a drawing of the layout of the experimental situation. And sometimes students will kind of get tangled up in the weeds of the setup that Sharif decided to use instead of focusing on the findings. So let's deal with the setup and then we'll move on. So participants were placed in a dark room, and they were exposed to a stationary light. They were asked to estimate how far the light had moved over the course of several trials. So these participants, when they were recruited, they were told they were in a visual perception experiment. They're in this completely dark room, and they're exposed to this light at the other end of the room. Now, what happens when you stare at a stationary point of light in a dark space, the light will appear to move. In actuality, the light didn't move. So what Sharif was taking advantage of was an optical sort of illusion called the autokinetic effect, where this stationary point of light appears to move, and it's almost like it will appear to wiggle. And that's sort of an artifact of just the way our eyes work. Now, avoid getting tangled up in that task. The key factor about the task is, since the light isn't moving, the estimates that people are making, there's no right answer to the question of how far is the light moving. So this is a situation where if you're the naive subject, you really don't have a lot of information to use to make your judgments. You don't want to look foolish or stupid by making the wrong judgment. And initially, people will make a guess, and they'll kind of stick to their own norm if they're by themselves. If they're together, though, in a group setting, so they start out making these judgments of how far the light moves by themselves, and people kind of settle into their own pattern, but then they're asked to make their judgments out loud in front of other people in a group setting. Now, the people in the group aren't going to discuss their judgments. They're just to make them out loud. So what Sharif is doing is saying, okay, we're going to have people make their independent judgments, but other people get to hear their judgments too. Now, all of the participants are sitting there going, I don't know how far it's moving. I'm going to guess. Well, over time, what happens is that these individuals will start to influence each other without even discussing it. If I started out saying the light moved 3 inches, and the person next to me says 6 inches, and the person next to that one says 5 inches, over time, we're all going to move into an estimate that's very close together, because you're making an ambiguous judgment, a guess, in a situation that is fully ambiguous. There's no right answer to be given at all. Even when you bring participants back, so Sharif, in a follow-up study, brought participants back a long time later and had them make their estimates alone. And once that group norm was established for how far the light moved, it was sticky. People would not deviate from that group norm. So when we think about this informational social influence effect, the effect, and I've pulled this graphic from your textbook over here that shows, you have 3 people illustrated here on the graphic. Person 1 makes a estimate around 7, person 2 around 2, person 3 around a half an inch. Over time, with other people making similar judgments out loud, people converge on a norm, on an average that they get pretty committed to. So in the study, what Sharif is trying to show is that when we are in a situation where we don't know what the right answer is, we don't know how to interpret the situation, we're not getting clear data that we can make our own independent judgment on, we will look to the actions of other people to help us figure it out. So here's a concrete example from everyday life. If you are in you live in an apartment, or you're living in a residence hall, there's always that time when a fire alarm goes off. And you and I both know the fire alarms are not always for real. Sometimes it's somebody's cute idea of a joke. Other times there's a real emergency. Sometimes there's a drill. So what do people typically do? You don't know which type of fire alarm this is. A real alarm, a fake malicious alarm, or a drill. So what you do is you poke your head out the hall and you see what other people are doing. If other people are running for the doors, you're more likely to follow them and assume that, yes, this is a real fire threat. If you're not seeing anyone in the hall, you're most likely to just go back in your room, shut the door, and wait, and pause. Now, this happened to me often when I was in graduate school. I was in school in Nebraska, which is flat, windy, and during tornado season, tornado warnings were constant. So in my apartment building, I lived on the 5th floor, no elevator. It was a task to have to go to the basement. I hated doing it for every little storm warning. And it was a tiny room that not everyone in the building could fit in, so it was going to be really uncomfortable. So I would get an alert on the radio or on the TV about a storm, and I would poke my head out the hall and see if other people were heading to the basement. Most of the time, no one was heading to the basement, so I just went back in my apartment and stayed put. And usually that doesn't cause a problem, but there are times where it does. When people misinterpret a situation or ignore warnings because they're not seeing other people engage in behaviors that are consistent with the warning being serious. Now, in research on normative social influence, remember that informational social influence is when we are persuaded to engage in behaviors because we don't know what the right course of action is, or we don't know the right judgment to make. In normative social influence, you're responding in a way that is based on social pressure and the desire not to be kicked out of the group. So it's referring to the expectations of the group itself. In Ash's study, in contrast to Sharif's, where you're in a completely ambiguous judgment situation, in the Sharif study, in the Ash study, it's crystal clear what the right answers are. So basically what participants had to do was look at the target line. So you see the graphic on your right. You look at the target line, and then you have to pick A, B, or C, which line matches the target line. And, for most people, they will correctly identify line C as the same length as the target line. In studies where people do this task alone, they make very, very, very few mistakes. And because the task is easy and the correct answer is obvious. So that obviousness of the answer or the behavior of choice, it makes this a very different kind of task than the one that was used in the Sharif study. So when people make the judgments alone, they tend not to make mistakes. What Ash then did was he built in, so if you're the naive subject, you've been recruited, you come into the laboratory, you're going to come in and sit down and at a table where several other people are already seated. You are told these are other participants in the study. So you believe that they're all in the same study with you. In fact, these were people playing a role. So what they're referred to as experimental Confederates. So what they did was then to intentionally, after some point in the study, make mistakes, obvious ones. So instead of saying C is the matching line, they would say A. And the critical factor was all of these Confederates would make the same mistake. They wouldn't make, it wouldn't be one of them says A, one of them says B, and the third one says A, and another one says B. They're not random. They're intentionally all saying A. Now, if you're the naive subject, you don't know that they are Confederates. You think that something's off here. You know what the right answer is. You start to question yourself. And this becomes a very powerful social situation for people. You're faced with a unanimous majority that is responding incorrectly, but they're unanimous, and that makes you uncomfortable. It makes most people uncomfortable. So what Ash found was that in that context, about 75% of the participants gave the same wrong answer that the Confederates gave at least once. So 3/4 of the time, you could see participants give at least one wrong answer. Conformity overall was about 1/3 of the time, so 37% of the time. So you need to qualify your understanding of what happened in this study. It wasn't that people just conformed and laid down and said, fine, I'll give the wrong answers. That's not what happened. About a little over 1/3 of the time, they conformed to the group. The other 2/3 of the time, they didn't. most people conformed at least once. There were some people who conformed never, and just persisted, but they weren't comfortable always doing it. So this kind of conformity occurred even though the correct answer was obvious. What this illustrates is how strong normative social influence can be. So when we want to fit in, when we want to get the approval of others around us, when we don't want to feel like we're stupid or we're not understanding the situation, we will go with the majority, especially if they are unanimous. So basically what we do is we'll change our behavior to meet those presumed expectations of others, largely with the goal of not being an outcast, not being seen as not good enough to be in the group. Privately, if, for instance, if these participants are asked, what were the right answers, they could easily give them. And when they were asked in some versions of the study, why did you give the wrong answer? And what people would say very clearly is, well, I didn't want to make waves with the group. It was weird that they kept giving the wrong answers. I kind of thought maybe I don't understand the instructions, but I'm pretty sure I did. So I just didn't want to make waves. That's the typical response that people gave in explaining their own behavior. Now, if Ash made the task really, really hard and the correct answers weren't so clear, so the target line was really close to in length to all three of the test lines, then everything shifts over to informational social influence, and you end up in the same situation as in Sharif's study, where a group norm kind of emerges and people will go with the majority in their group. That's informational. In the easy task, though, it's pure normative. And one of the ways that Ash was able to prove this was to show what if you flip the script? So instead of, say, 5 or 6 Confederates, you have 5 or 6 naive subjects and 1 Confederate. The Confederate is told, I want you to intentionally give the wrong answers. So they'll start out giving the correct answers to the line task, and then like on the 3rd trial, they'll start giving persistently wrong answers. Now, the first thing that group of naive subjects will do is try to help this person. They're like, do you not understand what the assignment is here? You're supposed to pick the line that matches, not the one that's the most different or whatever. So at first they try and teach them. Then they, if that person keeps giving the wrong answers, then they start looking at each other and kind of giggling and laughing. And if the person continues, then they will try and kind of push them to give the right answer, like they're messing things up. So they might even get irritated with them, and eventually they just lapse into teasing. Now, these were college student participants. So the reason why people conform in situations like this, where they know they're wrong, but the group is going in that direction, is because they don't want the outcomes that second version of the research showed, which was first they'll try and school you, then they'll try and push you, then they'll make fun of you, and you won't be a part of the club because they are bonding over your misbehavior, right? So that's what people really didn't want to experience, and that's the primary reason why they conformed as much as they did. Now, there are a lot of situational factors that influence conformity. Ash found that conformity decreased a lot when you have just one Confederate who gives incorrect answers. So in that case, it's just one person. You can continue giving your answers. So conformity rates were really pretty low. Another way of manipulating it, if you have a unanimous group, conformity goes way up. If you have one partner in deviancy. So if one person is different, so if one of the Confederates will give the correct answer at least part of the time, it kind of frees up the naive participant to give the correct answers more often. The mode of responding also matters too. So when Ash had people give their answers privately, so on paper, that no one else could see, then conformity went down to almost zero. Mostly because people just aren't aware of what's happening. They're not going to have the information that other people are giving incorrect answers, so there's no reason to change. So, this is one of the reasons we have private voting, is so that you won't be feeling like you need to conform in the face of other people making their ballots known. Another factor that matters is the status of the group members. When a group matters a lot to you, but you're in a low position of status, so you're not a core member of the group, you're on the periphery of the central participants in the group, but you're attracted to that group and you want to be a part of it, then you're likely to conform more. So think about social groups that you've wanted to join and you've wanted to be involved in, but you were on the outside, kind of looking at the core members of that group. One way of getting into the group more deeply is to conform with the behaviors and expectations of the people at the center. And that can, it's kind of like earning credits by behaving in concert with the other members of the group. Now, like those other situational factors, culture factors also matter too. There has been some research looking at conformity studies like those I've just described across cultures, because there has been some argument that individualistic cultures, like in Western Europe and North America, the pressure to conform would be less strong than in what are called collectivist cultures, like Eastern Europe, Asia, parts of Africa, for example. Basically, the assumption is that individualism emphasizes the person, their own personality, their needs, their successes. It tends to argue that conformity is a negative trait, and dissent is valued. So, arguing your own point, choosing your own needs, and pursuing your own goals is highly valued in individualistic cultures like ours. Collectivistic cultures, on the other hand, the emphasis is on the needs of the group. And there's a stronger emphasis on people putting their own needs below the needs of other people around them. Dissent is discouraged, conformity is welcomed. In fact, high degrees of individuality and autonomy are frowned on and maybe even used to define what is psychologically unhealthy. Now, in the research that many researchers have done, there has been some evidence that levels of conformity change over time, and they are sensitive to this individualism, collectivism dimension. In the United States, for example, conformity rates have been found to have declined somewhat since the 1950s, and that suggests that dovetails with the hyper-individualism that's really been become characteristic of our culture since that time. Conformity was more highly valued in the 1940s and 50s. In the 1960s, there was a counterculture movement, and a lot of humanistic thinking was starting to come into play, which suggests that every individual needs to pursue their own their own inborn needs, their own inborn goals and objectives. Collectivist countries have been found in this research to show overall somewhat higher levels of conformity than is the case in so-called individualist cultures. Although, as time is passing and Western culture, which tends to be individualistic, is more accessible around the globe, we're starting to see some of those conformity rates decline somewhat. Although in collectivist cultures, we still do see a much higher valuing on harmony and group needs, group values, and the avoidance of dissent. There's also some evidence that conformity is somewhat higher in females than in males. In part, this is due to sexual socialization, or genderal socialization rather, where the expectation is for females to defer and to, especially in the presence of males, to do what's expected of them. Now, over time, we've seen rates of conformity, comparisons between males and females getting smaller. The differences, the gender differences are getting smaller. Basically, females are catching up to males in terms of avoidance of conformity or resisting conformity. And that concludes part 1.